Chapter 9. When Stephanie woke up, her ears felt stopped up with pressure. She yawned and forced the uncomfortable pop that restored clearer hearing. She looked around and noticed that she was reclined in a soft seat. She returned to the left and noticed a few clouds in the purple evening skies outside an oval window. She suddenly jerked around as she realized that they were flying. "It's okay," whispered Sig. He came up from a seat further back and sat next to her. She breathed deeply as she tried to get control of her anxiety. "We're on the way to an airport in Punta Arenas," said Sig as he handed her a small electronic tablet. Her eyes widened as she powered it on. It took a few moments to boot up before showing a logo for the company Fine Broadcasting Corporation. She shuddered as she remembered William Fine using her to see the future. She had wanted to resist him, but his control was too great. She felt ashamed and used. Finally, the logo disappeared. She gripped the tablet, determining to use something of his for her benefit, as if to retaliate. After a few moments of tinkering, she found a text-to-speech tool. "He knows we are here," said Stephanie in a manly voice from the tablet. She tweaked the settings. "He knows we are here," she said again in a feminine voice. Sig smiled. "We know. It's his plane," he said. "He knows where we are going," she said. "Probably," agreed Sig. "We knew that he was headed to the South Pole. He is going to try to take control of the Archdemon," continued Stephanie. "Will he?" asked Sig sincerely. "I don't know," said Stephanie. She looked at the ground. "It's so dark in the future there. I can't see what's happening." Sig scratched his head in confusion. Stephanie had made it sound like a room with the light turned off. He had no idea what to do to turn it on to help her, or even if it would be a good idea if he did know how to do it. "I'm sure things will work out," said Sig at last with a smile. "You can be confident," said Stephanie, "but I am supposed to know." Sig smiled. "Until you do, trust me," he whispered. She took a deep breath and finally returned Sig's confident smile. He laughed and returned to his seat. She turned around to see that everyone else seemed occupied. Row 82 was talking about the plane with Lucas in the cockpit. Jennifer was sleeping, or perhaps pretending to sleep, on Victor's shoulder, and he was softly running his fingers through her golden hair. Jonathan was having a conversation with Kirana. Sig had begun fiddling with a tablet of his own. She decided she might as well go back to sleep. Jonathan and Kirana spoke in low voices, but their conversation was not romantic. Jonathan was describing his last battle with William Fine. "He could predict both my movements and Sam's," said Jonathan. "I didn't know what I would do." "I guess he wasn't paying attention to mine," said Kirana. "That must be when I escaped then," said Jonathan. "You've saved me again." "Don't get all emotional on me," said Kirana with a frown. "Sorry," said Jonathan as he lowered his voice. "So if he could take control of Stephanie, why didn't he do that the first time you fought him?" asked Kirana. "He had been so focused on taking control of Victor," said Jonathan. "I don't think he realized who he had." "Well, speaking of Victor," said Kirana, "did you have another visit with Michael?" "No," said Jonathan. "I don't know what his motivation is." "Or if he is an actual archangel," said Kirana. "We should talk to Lucas about it when he's not busy flying this thing." Jonathan smiled widely. "I had nearly forgotten," said Jonathan as he peeked out the window toward the setting sun and smiled. "We're riding on the air." "Yeah, good for us," said Kirana unenthusiastically. "You don't like it?" asked Jonathan. "I guess I like having the high ground," said Kirana, "but something about this makes me feel vulnerable. I'll be happy to be on solid ground again." The plane shuddered as it hit turbulent air. Kirana gripped the arms of her chair tightly. Jonathan softly put his hand over hers. She normally would have resisted, but she could not deny that she felt a bit safer with Jonathan next to her. She smiled softly. I think I better try to get some sleep, Jonathan, said Kirana. Can I lean on you? Jonathan smiled widely and nodded. She rested her head on his shoulder. He put his arm around her, and she closed her eyes. Lucas was surprised at how well Row 82 was able to pick up on the functions of the various gauges, levers, and switches in the cockpit. The augment had a natural ability to perceive what things were. As soon as Lucas was comfortable with Row 82's assessment, Lucas let him pilot while he got a little rest. Several hours passed as they flew further south. Sig had arranged for Jonathan to communicate telepathically with Lizard so that he knew they would be heading to Punta Arenas at the southern part of the continent. Lizard was to see if he could locate a ship that would be able to transport them to Antarctica. As the plane flew further south, everyone took turns sleeping and waking up. They were pleased to see the food and warm clothing as well as other emergency supplies in the plane, as these would be vital in their trip to the pole. The only person who did not wake up was Stephanie. She remained sound asleep. The others determined that Stephanie was probably avoiding the sensation of flying and that it was best to leave her alone. The truth was that she was having a vision. "Stephanie," said Michael. "Victor?" asked Stephanie. "I thought that Jonathan might have told you my identity," said Michael. "Obviously he hasn't." Stephanie bit her lower lip. She was still a bit heartbroken over Jonathan, and being reminded that he was not talking to her felt like salt in a wound. "So who are you?" asked Stephanie. "My name is Michael," he answered. "I am an archangel." Stephanie's eyes grew wide. "Where are you?" asked Stephanie. "I mean, obviously you aren't just a figment of my mind. The others have seen you too." "Well, not all of them," said Michael, "but a part of me is inside each of them." "So it's not a natural property that causes a person to be a key-bearer," said Stephanie. "You choose them." "Correct," said Michael. "Why did you choose Daniel Young?" said Stephanie angrily. "You knew what he would do." "That's true," said Michael. "And you could have told us," said Stephanie. "You could have stopped him." "That's also true," said Michael calmly. Stephanie waited for an explanation, but Michael clearly felt no obligation to explain himself. "Well, why?" demanded Stephanie. "There had to be a destroyer," explained Michael. "He shaped the world into which you were born, and I needed all of you to fulfill the purpose of the divine keys." "What is their purpose if not to save humanity?" said Stephanie. "Why could we not save those that were slaughtered by Daniel Young? Why could we not have spared those at the healing shrine? How could you let Erica die?" A tear rolled down Stephanie's cheek as she remembered the sick feeling that had crept into her gut as she watched the life slip away from Erica. "It was her time to die," said Michael. "It was her destiny." "That's it?" asked Stephanie angrily as tears streamed down her cheeks. "My mother, Erica, the hundreds of victims in the cave, they were supposed to die?" "Yes," said Michael. "I thought you were supposed to be an angel," said Stephanie in a low voice. "You are angry because you do not understand," said Michael. "You're just now figuring that out?" shouted Stephanie as she wiped her eyes. "Stephanie," said Michael calmly, "you have a divine key of omniscience. Do you not know what is coming?" Michael pointed to the horizon. There was snow everywhere. She squinted her eyes to make out a strange figure in the distance. "What is that?" asked Stephanie. "It is Abaddon," answered Michael. Suddenly his terrible claws emitting dark purple beams to propel him forward became visible. Stephanie shuddered as she watched the destroyer plow through the snow with tremendous speed. She raised her hands to shield herself from the ice being thrown up in his wake. "Where is he going?" asked Stephanie. "To a place buried under the ice," said Michael. "To the Archdemon's prison." Stephanie watched as the ground began to shake and a blinding light appeared on the horizon in the direction where Abaddon had gone. A few moments later, the thundering sound of a blast threw Stephanie backwards. She skidded across the ground several yards in the snow before getting back up. "What was that?" shouted Stephanie. "Have a look," said Michael. Suddenly the two of them stood in a large crater. Dust and ice were still slowly falling from the explosion, but she was able to see Abaddon, who stood before a mirrored box in the middle of the crater. "What is he doing?" whispered Stephanie. "What is that?" "He has exposed the top of the Archdemon's prison," replied Michael. "What does he want?" asked Stephanie. "To free his master," replied Michael. "He believes that his loyalty will earn him power." Abaddon began blasting the mirrored surface with his cutting beam. The energy began melting the ice around the prison. Slowly the mirrored box was exposed to be the top of a massive and complex polyhedron that surrounded the reaching arm of something massive. The end of the arm was lacking any claws or fingers or even a hand. Slowly the head of the creature began to be exposed. The mirrored prison surrounded a set of massive horns with a complex series of rectangular cylinders. Eventually a pair of dark glowing eyes became visible. Abaddon stopped his beam and appeared to breathe heavily as though he were exhausted. The look of greed on Abaddon's now monstrous face was clear. A moment later he shouted and unleashed another cutting beam on the mirrored prison in which the Archdemon was trapped. "Can he do that?" Stephanie asked nervously. A terrible crack echoed through the crater as if to answer her question. Abaddon stopped his cutting beam to examine his work. He had created a weakness in the prison. He laughed loudly and began cutting again. "What will happen if the Archdemon escapes?" asked Stephanie. "Touch your key and see," replied Michael calmly. "It allows me to see possibilities?" asked Stephanie. Michael nodded. Stephanie touched her mirrored key, and her eyes began glowing brightly. Suddenly she saw the massive Archdemon rising from his prison. Abaddon laughed loudly as the horned monstrosity adjusted his body. Its horns and dark glowing eyes gave it a horrifying appearance. Stephanie shuddered as he stood. He was nearly 30 feet tall and had long spikes coming from his shoulders and arms. Every step he took made the earth shake. His rough skin and jagged teeth were terrifying. The Archdemon looked at the stump where his hand would have been and roared. The sound was paralyzing. Stephanie could feel the hatred as though it were flowing from the monster and crashing into her. "There are 5 who have broken it and claimed your powers as their own," said Abaddon, explaining what had happened to the Archdemon's hand. The Archdemon roared again. "Yes, Master," replied Abaddon almost gleefully. "They are on this world." The Archdemon slammed his good hand into the ground. Suddenly the entire earth began reeling. Huge chunks of ice and rock began flying apart. In a few moments, lava began flowing as the earth broke into pieces. "He's destroying the earth!" screamed Stephanie in horror. "Not completely," said Michael. "He won't kill everyone. Almost everyone, but he will ensure he saves a few for breeding." "What? Why?" asked Stephanie as the ground on which she stood was thrown out into space. "The power of human sacrifice is even of interest to the Archdemon," replied Michael. There was a bright flash of light, and Stephanie found herself in the plane with the others, yet she knew she was still in a vision since Michael was next to her. "I still don't understand," said Stephanie. "Why didn't you stop Daniel Young if you knew he was going to do that?" "Even if Daniel Young is stopped, what is to be done about the Archdemon?" asked Michael. "Why not let him stay in his prison?" asked Stephanie. "Let that possibility play out," said Michael. She touched her key and watched as her surroundings faded again, and she saw Felix Light lying on the ground. She felt herself being pulled through the tunnels he had dug through the mountains to establish a base in the hot zone. Faster and faster the tunnel blurred past her. Finally she began slowing down until she came to a wall. She stood there for a few moments and then turned to Michael. "What is this?" she asked. "Watch," said Michael. A moment later the wall crumbled, revealing a crazed group of augments that barked like dogs. She leapt back with fright. "Where did they come from?" asked Stephanie. No sooner did she ask than the two of them began rushing through the tunnel that the augments had dug. After a few minutes, the rock and dirt was replaced by ice. They seemed to accelerate rapidly through the icy tunnels. Finally, they began slowing down. Stephanie fell forward as she tried to get control of the dizzy feeling that she had felt after rushing through the tunnel. She slowly got up and gasped as she saw the emotionless face of William Fine. "What is this?" asked Stephanie. "He is reclaiming his hand," said Michael. A few moments later, the barking augments were back with the black key that had hung about Felix Light's neck. William Fine's key has already restored to him the power of mind possession and domination. Now Felix Light's key will make his armies extremely fast. Dark energy seeped out of the ground and surrounded the augments. They rushed with incredible speed out the tunnel. Everything seemed to fade, and before long, hundreds of augments returned with another black key. "The reincarnation key that they captured from Catherine Page will make his armies practically immortal," continued Michael. "The fire key from David Sawyer will make them living weapons, and they will penetrate the fortress that Sarah Hawkins put up to defend against the Archdemon, even though she knew it would be pointless. Her key will complete the Archdemon's hand, and he will be able to see and exploit the weakness in the prison to free himself." Stephanie watched as hundreds of augments shot beams of fire and circled around the prison. After a while, the Archdemon broke out of his prison and roared with a deafening laugh. He pressed his clawed hand against the ground. A moment later, the earth shattered and globs of lava and chunks of earth and ice went flying into space. "But this isn't destiny," said Stephanie. She found herself seated back in her plane seat next to Michael. "No," answered Michael hesitantly. "We can change it," said Stephanie. "Well, yes," said Michael. "We can change all of it," said Stephanie excitedly. "And Jennifer can travel through time, so we can fix it." "That's the end goal, yes, but I'm not sure you understand," said Michael. Stephanie ignored Michael as her mind raced, considering the possibility of seeing Erica again, or perhaps even her mother. She was convinced that Jennifer was the key to righting every wrong. A world without destiny was perhaps less romantic and moving than the one that Sig had described when he had thought they were meant to fix things, but for Stephanie, it provided a fresh new flavor. For the first time since Erica had died, she felt hope. Her visions had convinced her that they were doing the right thing to stop Abaddon from awakening the Archdemon. They would need more time to formulate a plan. Lucas and Row 82 could help her formulate the strategy, and then they could go back in time. Stephanie looked down at her mirrored key and realized that she was awake in the literal world in the plane. Michael was nowhere to be seen. Across the aisle, Jennifer was snoring on Victor's shoulder. He did not seem to mind, and she decided she did not mind either. After all, the power of the time key would help them reshape destiny, and with some luck, save the world.